Welcome to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. There's a narrow street in Gloucester where nothing ever happens. At least that's what the locals will tell you. Eyes forward, voices low. Some say the houses all look the same, red-bricked and prim. Others remember one house that stood out, even after it was torn down. 25 Cromwell Street. I know the place well. I walked past it for years, even after they replaced it with a sterile pathway and some shrubs. But if you stand there long enough, especially around 3 a.m., you'll swear you hear something. A floorboard creaking under no one's foot. A soft hum from a bathroom that no longer exists. Tonight, we're unraveling the quiet nightmare of Fred and Rose West, two people who lived like ghosts among their neighbors, charming at the pub, polite in the store, but who turned their own home into a tomb, a horror museum, a trap. It's not just the number of victims, it's the way they lived with the dead. And this story, well, it begins with a body buried under a patio, but it doesn't end there. The main voice you'll be hearing is mine, but you'll feel Fred and Rose all around us. This is not a story for the easily unsettled. It's slow, suffocating, and terribly real. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me your location and what time it is where you're listening. I want to know how far this story travels. Let me take you back to the summer of 1994. The house still stood then. Beige paint peeling from the sills, a concrete driveway, and a garden that no one dared play in. Police had been sniffing around for weeks. There was a rumor that Fred's daughter, Heather, had run off years earlier after a fight, but the family had always laughed it off. Said she joined a cult or maybe moved to Ireland, but she never called, never sent a card. Her younger siblings, too scared to ask, just accepted the silence, until one of them said something. An offhand comment to a teacher. "She's under the patio," they'd muttered. At first, the police didn't quite believe it. It sounded like the sort of grim joke kids make when they're angry at their parents. But they filed a report, and a few months later, they showed up with shovels. Fred opened the door like he always did, smiling, confident, hair slicked back. Rose wasn't home that day. She was at her job, caring for children. Yes, children. The police asked to take a look around. Fred, ever the host, offered them tea. But the officers didn't waste time. They went straight for the garden. The patio was old. Concrete slabs, heavy and sun-stained. Fred insisted he'd laid it himself after a plumbing job. Said it was just pipes down there. Nothing else. But pipes don't smell like that. When they lifted the first slab, the soil was damp. Too damp. Then came a scent no one forgets. And a rib. Just one at first, pale and curved like a question mark. A question that would take 11 more bodies to answer. Here's a strange fact. The body they found first wasn't even Heather's. It belonged to a young woman who'd vanished in the late 70s. She'd been reported missing by a hostel, but no one followed up. As police dug deeper, Fred's calm began to fray. He kept muttering about permits, about building codes, and then, without being asked, he offered up the truth. "They're all down there," he said. "You'll find 7 in the garden, a couple in the cellar, 1 in the bathroom wall." Just like that. Historians are still debating whether Fred wanted to be caught, or whether he just couldn't remember which lie he'd told last. Some believe his confession was his way of maintaining control, even in the face of exposure. Others think it was panic, a final performance. The officers stood in stunned silence. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was a graveyard. And all this time, neighbors had walked by. Children had played nearby. Postmen had delivered letters. No one had guessed. But the most terrifying part? The house didn't feel like a haunted one. It wasn't gothic or overgrown. It was neat, bland, totally ordinary. That was Fred and Rose's genius. They didn't hide their horrors underground. They hid them in plain sight, behind washing lines and casseroles and Christmas lights, while inside, behind locked doors, women screamed. I passed that house once, years before the story broke. I was on a school trip. We waited outside while the teacher ran in to ask for directions. Fred came to the door, smiled at us, waved. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think about that wave. The strange thing about Heather West's disappearance wasn't that she vanished. It was how calmly her family treated it. When a 16-year-old girl disappears from a working-class British family in the late 1980s, people usually panic. But not the Wests. Fred and Rose seemed to treat it as if Heather had merely misplaced herself. They offered vague, cheerful explanations to friends. "She got a job up north," they'd say one day. "Ran off with a girlfriend," they'd say another. And then they'd laugh. That was what made people uneasy. Not that Heather was gone, but that no one seemed to care. Heather had been described by school staff as quiet, reserved, not particularly rebellious. Teachers remembered her as kind, if a little anxious. She never got into trouble, but she never stayed behind to chat either. As one former teacher later said, Heather looked like someone who was always about to cry, but never did. There was one incident at school that stood out. She once begged a friend to let her sleep over, said she didn't want to go home. When pressed, Heather said something chilling. Bad things happen there, but only at night. At the time, no one thought much of it. Teenage melodrama, maybe, but it sat in the file. And when she vanished in 1987 and never contacted anyone again, not a postcard, not a phone call, well, that comment started to feel a whole lot heavier. Fred and Rose had a clever way of deflecting suspicion. They'd crack jokes about Heather being buried under the patio if she kept acting up. It was so over the top, people assumed it was just dark humor. You know, that British sarcasm that gets passed off as harmless. But in hindsight, it was confession disguised as comedy. Here's a strange fact. In the years following Heather's disappearance, 3 of her younger siblings tried to run away from home. One made it as far as a bus terminal before being dragged back. Another was found sleeping in the playground of a nearby school. All of them said the same thing. "We're scared we'll end up like Heather." The local social services were called more than once, but nothing ever stuck. Rose put on her best smile. The house looked tidy enough. The children were clothed. They had packed lunches. It was the 1980s, and unless there were bruises, no one looked deeper. It wasn't until 1992, 5 years after Heather vanished, that things started to unravel. One of the younger West children, during a routine school session, casually told a counselor that Heather was in the garden. The counselor assumed the child meant Heather liked to sit outside. But when they clarified, the child simply said, "No, she's under the garden." That set off a quiet alert to Child Protection Services, who notified police. Still, no one rushed in. It would take 2 more years and a more direct report of sexual abuse inside the household before police had the authority to dig. And that brings us back to the moment in part 1, when Fred watched the garden get torn up and asked if the officers had a permit for excavation. That was Fred's way of controlling the moment. Not fear, not denial, bureaucracy. Historians are still debating whether Heather was killed intentionally or if she simply found out too much. Some theorize she discovered what Fred and Rose were doing to their tenants or to their own children. Others believe she threatened to go to the police. Whatever the reason, she went from daughter to liability in their eyes. And in the West household, liabilities disappeared. What's unsettling is that Fred didn't kill Heather in a fit of rage, according to later testimony. He planned it. He discussed it with Rose. They even waited until the other children were asleep. Then they buried her under the patio, poured fresh concrete, planted a few shrubs, and for years they sat out there on sunny days, drinking tea, reading the paper, hosting barbecues. I keep picturing that, the garden chairs, the white plastic table, Fred grilling sausages while Rose passes out paper plates. The other kids laughing, not knowing their sister was 6 feet below their feet, still wearing her school uniform. One day, long before it all came out, a neighbor asked Rose where Heather had gone. Rose gave them a funny look and said, "She's fertilizer now." The neighbor laughed awkwardly. It sounded like a joke. Except it wasn't. Fred and Rose were dangerous, not just because they were killers, but because they were experts at pretending they weren't. They weaponized ordinary, used it like camouflage. And the thing that gets under your skin the most? The people who lived around them, their neighbors, the teachers, even friends, they all had a feeling, a gut twinge, a pause in the back of their mind. But they shrugged it off, because surely no one could do something like that in broad daylight, right? People used to say Fred West had builder's hands. Thick-knuckled, always a little dirty, calloused palms like bark. He'd work on homes across Gloucester, roofing, plastering, laying brick. A man who knew concrete like a priest knows scripture. But no one asked what he was building when he worked late into the night, or why he always ordered just a little too much cement. Fred was born in 1941 in Herefordshire, a small town, the kind with one pub and no secrets, except, apparently, for the Wests. His childhood wasn't just tough, it was toxic. His father reportedly encouraged incest and bestiality. His mother? Some say she was overprotective, others whisper she was complicit. By the time Fred left school, he couldn't read or write properly. But he had charm, that strange, greasy kind that snakes use when they sway in front of birds. He married his first wife, Catherine Rena Costello, in the early 60s. She already had a child, and they had 2 more together. But that home, too, would turn dark. Fred was accused of abusing young girls, even his stepdaughter. And after several suspicious disappearances, including his nanny, Anna McFall, Rena and one of their children vanished completely. Later, bones would tell their story. Fred liked to say he was just unlucky in love. Here's a strange fact. Fred was once in a motorcycle accident that left a metal plate in his head. Afterward, he claimed to have memory problems and headaches. Some psychologists later argued this trauma contributed to his lack of impulse control. But that doesn't explain the calculations, the planning, the patience. If anything, the injury just made him better at pretending to be clumsy. He met Rose in 1969 at a bus stop. She was just 15. He was 28. Rosemary Letts came from a whole different flavor of dysfunction. Her mother had undergone electroshock therapy while pregnant, and her father was a violent, authoritarian figure with neo-Nazi leanings. Rose had grown up isolated, often babysitting her siblings. And when she met Fred, something clicked. She moved in with him shortly after. Within a year, they were partners, not just romantically, but in something far darker. They abused Fred's stepdaughters together. When Rena came to retrieve her kids, she vanished. Later, so did her friend. And later still, so did their lodger. Fred kept working as a builder. Quiet jobs, cash under the table. He liked that life. No contracts, no records, no questions. He'd fix pipes by day and dig graves at night. He and Rose married in 1972. Neighbors said they were affectionate, always holding hands, but their home was a different story. Children came and went, teenagers with nowhere else to go. Some stayed as lodgers, others were never seen again. Historians are still debating whether Fred was the leader or if Rose was the real force behind it all. Some argue Fred had the experience. He'd killed before Rose even arrived. But others point to Rose's escalating violence, her cruelty even toward her own children, as evidence that she wasn't just helping. She was driving. What's clear is that Fred wasn't doing this alone. Not anymore. He started adding strange features to their home. A secret cellar room, a second bathroom with a bolt on the outside, floorboards that lifted a little too easily, and always a garden that kept getting re-landscaped. In 1973, Rose gave birth to another child, and another, and another. Over the years, they'd have a dozen between them. Some were biologically Freds, some weren't. A few still don't know who their fathers are. What's chilling is that Fred sometimes recorded birthdays by pouring new concrete. If that doesn't make your skin crawl, it should. Still, the family kept up appearances. They had birthday parties. The kids went to school, some of the time. Fred even volunteered as a driver for disabled children. That alone sends a shiver down your spine. There's one image I can't shake. Fred, in his overalls, wiping his hands on a rag. A neighbor stops to chat about gardening. They talk roses and hydrangeas, while just beneath them lies a 17-year-old girl, wrapped in plastic and pipe insulation. Fred even jokes about digging a bit too deep. They laugh. Then he goes back to work, humming. A lot of serial killers hide their urges. They compartmentalize. But Fred West lived with his crimes like old furniture, familiar, dusty, part of the decor. The bodies weren't buried in some remote forest. They were in the walls, the floor, the garden, just inches away from breakfast toast and children's toys. You ever think about how many times someone walked over a body without knowing? Stepped across tiles laid over a teenager's bones? Fred thought it was funny. And the sickest part? Sometimes he was right. If you've ever wondered what evil sounds like in handwriting, read Rose West's letters to Fred. They weren't just affectionate. They were obsessive, long, flowing pages filled with "My darling Freddie" and "Your ever-loving wife." She wrote about love, about sex, about punishments, and underneath it all a strange thread of control, as if each line wasn't meant to woo Fred, but to warn him. See, while Fred had killed before Rose, he had never partnered with anyone who embraced the horror quite like she did. Rose wasn't coerced. She wasn't tricked. She thrived. Theirs wasn't a typical marriage. It was more like a power grid. Fred was the chaos, and Rose was the current that made everything spark. While he dug holes in the garden, she ran a side operation upstairs, a brothel. Yes, from their family home. Clients came and went through the same door the children used to go to school. There was a red light installed in the window, so subtle you'd miss it unless you knew what to look for. The kids were told not to interrupt when Mummy's working. And Fred, he was completely on board, sometimes watching, sometimes joining. Here's a strange fact. Rose kept a diary of her clients, writing down their preferences, payment, and times. It was meticulous, organized, like a business ledger. She wasn't ashamed, not even a little. Neighbors said Rose could be warm and chatty. She wore bright floral dresses. She smiled at babies. But behind closed doors, she was vicious. She beat the children regularly, some biological, some not. She'd scream for hours, then pretend nothing happened. One former neighbor recalled seeing a little girl standing in the garden with a bruised face, holding a broken doll. When asked what happened, the girl said, "Mom says I shouldn't cry because no one cares." Historians are still debating the exact dynamic between Fred and Rose. Was Rose the dominant one? Did Fred fear her? Or were they perfectly aligned in sadism? Complementary psychopaths. A few psychologists even argue that Rose's violence sometimes surpassed Fred's, that she was colder, more calculated, less interested in the performance, more in the suffering. Fred liked to talk. Rose preferred to act. One of the most haunting discoveries during the investigation was a collection of letters Fred had hidden behind loose bricks in the basement wall. Most were from Rose. They were handwritten in cursive, smudged in places from dirty fingers or maybe tears. In one, she wrote, open quote, "You are my world, my fire, my Freddie. No matter what they say, no matter what they find, they'll never understand us." Close quote. Another read, open quote, "Punish the little bitches when they lie. I know you will. You're strong. You're good." Close quote. There's no delicate way to say this. Rose took pleasure in violence, not just tolerated it, not just assisted. She initiated. And the children in that house? They learned quickly to tiptoe through shadows, to lie still when footsteps passed the door, to smile for visitors. You might be thinking, why didn't someone stop this? How could it go unnoticed for so long? Well, part of it was fear. But part of it was the perfect storm of dysfunction in the UK's 70s and 80s child protection system. Social services visited the Wests multiple times. Complaints were made, reports were filed, but there were no cell phones then, no viral videos, and the system was slow, underfunded, and tragically skeptical of poor kids with wild stories. Fred and Rose knew this. They used it. If a child acted out in school, Fred would march in, smiling, and say, "You know how kids lie, don't you?" Rose would nod solemnly. "She watches too much telly," she'd add. And the teachers would sigh. Make a note. Move on. Rose's cruelty wasn't limited to children. One victim, Lucy Partington, was abducted on her way home from a Christmas visit. Fred later admitted that she was held in the cellar for several days, tortured. When they finally killed her, Rose helped clean up. Fred even collected Lucy's fingernails, kept them in a matchbox in his toolbox. Yes, let that sink in. There was one chilling pattern that emerged over time. Rose often wore victims' clothing, blouses, hair clips, even shoes. The children remember this. They'd see new items appear in her wardrobe, always a little tight, a little off, like they weren't meant for her. But if they asked questions, she'd smile and say, "I'm not in the mood for backchat." Ironic, really, considering how much backchat she kept in her letters. Even in prison, years later, Rose continued to write to Fred. Before his suicide, she told him to stay strong and not let them twist your mind. The letters were obsessive, paranoid, and intimate, like she still believed they were untouchable. But by then, the police had already pulled 7 bodies from the garden, and they were just getting started. You ever wonder what kind of love survives that? Maybe the kind that's rotten from the start, built on blood and concrete, written in lipstick and buried under floorboards. People came and went from 25 Cromwell Street like it was a train station. Teenagers, young women, drifters, sex workers, runaways. Some of them were lodgers. Some of them were victims. Sometimes it was hard to tell which was which until they stopped coming back. Fred and Rose liked the type of people no one missed. Girls with bad home lives, foster kids, women struggling with addiction or estranged from their families. They called it offering help, rent-free rooms, a warm meal, and the promise of safety. But no one ever stayed too long, and the ones who disappeared, well, they disappeared completely. In the early 1970s, the Wests began advertising for live-in nannies or tenants. They'd post notes in shop windows, offering room and board for young women. Fred would charm them at first. Rose would offer tea. They'd ask about your family, whether anyone knew where you were staying. It was like a checklist for disposal. Once the girls moved in, the rules changed. Doors locked from the outside, food withheld, sexual demands disguised as family favors. And if they resisted, well, Fred always had a reason to go downstairs, into the cellar. Here's a strange fact. Several victims were last seen carrying suitcases. Police later found dozens of those cases buried in walls, under floorboards, and even hidden behind false paneling. Still packed, still zipped, as if the girls never got a chance to unpack. One of the first confirmed victims was Linda Goff. She was 19. She wore bright lipstick, liked dancing. Her friends say she was trusting, too trusting. She moved in with Fred and Rose after a fight with her parents. Just needed a few weeks to get her head sorted, she told them. She never came home. Rose told people that Linda had run off with a bloke, but a few days later she was spotted wearing Linda's clothes. And one of the other children noticed a necklace that looked familiar. When they asked about it, Rose just stared at them. No expression. Then said, "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to." Years later, Linda's body was found in the cellar. She had been dismembered, teeth removed, finger bones scattered separately. It was as though Fred was trying to erase her piece by piece. But he didn't hide everything. Police later found remains with duct tape still wrapped around the skull, hair stuck to the tape, a gag in place. These weren't rushed killings. These were rituals. Historians are still debating how the Wests chose their victims. Was it opportunity? Did they stalk some girls in advance? Or was it spontaneous, the wrong person ringing the wrong doorbell at the wrong time? Some believe Fred had a pattern, while others say the only pattern was chaos. And yet, there were always those neighbors, always those little moments that, in hindsight, should have meant more. Like the woman who lived next door and heard crying through the walls. She assumed it was one of the West children being punished. But the cries weren't childish. They were low, guttural, like someone begging. And then, silence. Or the local cab driver who picked up a distraught girl from the area. She claimed she'd been locked in a room for days. She didn't name names, just said she had to leave town, fast. When police were contacted, they found no record of a missing girl matching her description. Another ghost in the file. Fred and Rose didn't just murder in the traditional sense. They erased people, burned clothes, filed off fingerprints. In some cases, they removed kneecaps and other identifying bones. Who even thinks to do that? One officer involved in the excavation said the basement felt like a human filing cabinet. Bones tucked into corners, teeth scattered, nothing whole. The Wests kept the house noisy to drown out the sounds. Fred would often use power tools at night, saws, drills, even concrete mixers. Neighbors complained, but Fred just joked, always improving the place. And for a while, people believed him. You ever hear something at night and convince yourself it's nothing? Just the pipes, just the wind. Now imagine that thought saving your sanity. It wasn't just outsiders they hurt. Even girls who knew the Wests personally weren't safe. Caroline Owens, a 17-year-old who once worked as a nanny for the family, narrowly escaped with her life. Fred and Rose abducted her after she left her job, tied her up, sexually assaulted her, and threatened to kill her. Somehow, she talked them into letting her go. She went straight to the police, but the charges were dropped after Fred pleaded guilty to a lesser offense. He paid a fine and walked away. Walked away to kill again. That moment, the failure of the system, is something Caroline has spoken about for years. She could have been the final girl, the full stop. But instead, she was just a comma in a sentence that went on for another decade. When police eventually began digging through 25 Cromwell Street in 1994, they uncovered not just bodies, but names. Girls who hadn't been missing. Girls who had never been reported. Because no one even realized they were gone. That's the most haunting part of all. Not the deaths, but the forgetting. If hell had a guest room, it might look a lot like the second bathroom at 25 Cromwell Street. It wasn't on any official floor plan. Fred built it himself. Bad plumbing, poor ventilation, a single drain in the middle of the floor. A thick bolt on the outside of the door. And inside, just a bare bulb, faded tiles, and the faint smell of bleach that never seemed to go away. Fred called it the workroom. Rose just smiled and said, "That's where we clean up." Let that phrase sit with you for a second. Police would later find out that this room was where several victims were tortured before being killed. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Fred was methodical. Rose was violent. Together, they turned domestic architecture into a weapon. Here's a strange fact. Fred kept a small tool bag hidden behind a bathroom panel. It contained gags, restraints, surgical gloves, and several pairs of pliers, each marked with a piece of colored tape, like a twisted form of organization. One investigator described it as a dentist's kit for people he didn't plan to fix. But what's worse is how ordinary it all looked. The West children remember being told to avoid that bathroom. If they asked why, Rose would say, "It's for guests." But they never saw any guests come out. Mae West, Fred and Rose's daughter, would later recall one of her most vivid memories, being told to stay in her room because Mummy was having a private meeting. She heard muffled voices, a girl crying, and then the sound of running water for a very long time. Later that night, Fred cooked dinner like nothing happened. Fish fingers and peas. That was their rhythm. Everyday evil, masked by meat and potatoes. Sometimes the Wests would even invite family over while a victim was locked in that room. Imagine that. Laughing over roast dinners while someone screamed through the floorboards. One time, Fred played loud music during a gathering. Said he was testing a new speaker system. Neighbors said they heard a woman shouting, but figured it was a rowdy party. Historians are still debating whether Rose took the lead in these moments or if Fred was always in charge. One theory suggests Fred set the trap and Rose delivered the punishment. Others argue that Fred was the fantasist, while Rose was the enforcer, the one who turned dreams into real, bloody rituals. The truth might be more disturbing. They were both committed, equally, to the routine. The only difference was tone. Fred was excited by pain. Rose was comforted by it. And yet, amid the horror, they were weirdly mundane. Rose kept the bathroom clean. She scrubbed it after each session, changed the towels, even sprayed lavender air freshener, like you'd do after a guest leaves a polite visit. It's that contrast, the mix of house-proud chores and monstrous acts, that makes this case so suffocating. You want to believe killers are messy, erratic, obvious, but Fred and Rose were tidy, controlled, predictable. One police officer, during the forensic examination of the house, accidentally stepped on a soft spot in the hallway floor. When they pulled up the wood, they found bone fragments and a single sandal. Just one. No one ever claimed it. Several victims were identified only by dental records, when there were teeth left. Fred often extracted them with pliers. Not to hide identity, he later said, but because they looked better without them. That quote appeared in court transcripts. You could hear the courtroom fall silent when it was read aloud. And then there were the photos. Fred kept Polaroids. Not a lot, just enough to suggest a pattern. Some were cropped, others damaged. But a few showed what they did in that bathroom. They were shown to the jury during Rose's trial. Only the jury. Even the press weren't permitted to describe them fully. But one detail leaked. In at least two of the photos, Rose is smiling. One of the most horrific stories came from a girl who escaped. We don't know her real name. She was only ever called Fiona in the transcripts. She'd been picked up hitchhiking. Fred offered her a place to stay, promised a warm bed and a proper meal. She was locked in the bathroom for nearly 24 hours. But then, by some miracle, Fred forgot to bolt the door after bringing her food. She snuck out, barefoot, bleeding, and ran until her legs gave out. She flagged down a postman, could barely speak. They rushed her to the hospital. But when she tried to explain, the story sounded too wild. No full name, no address, just a description of a brown brick house with a red door. Police wrote it down and moved on. That was 1988. Fred and Rose didn't slow down afterward. If anything, they got bolder. That room stayed in use for at least another 5 years. You know, people always talk about haunted houses. Ghosts in the attic, cold spots in the hallway. But what haunts me is this. There were no ghosts in that house, only bodies. And the real horror was that the screams were real, the blood was fresh, and the monsters were still alive. Making tea. There's a soft spot beneath the stairs at 25 Cromwell Street. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't looking. Just a slightly different sound when you step on it. More of a hollow thud than a creak. But the police noticed. After digging up the garden and pulling bones from flower beds, they began peeling back layers inside the house. That soft spot led to one of the most heartbreaking discoveries in the entire investigation. The remains of Heather West. Fred and Rose's own daughter. Let me say that again slowly. They murdered their daughter. their biological child, and buried her under the house like she was insulation. It's hard to know where to begin with Heather's story. She was born in 1970, the fifth of the West children. She was quiet, serious, bookish. Teachers described her as timid but bright. But at home, she was watched. Every move monitored. Every expression studied for rebellion. Heather began to speak out when she was a teenager. She told a friend at school that something wasn't right at home, that she was scared of her parents, especially her mother. That friend told a teacher. The teacher told social services. But nothing happened. Rose cleaned the children up, made them wear neat uniforms, and served tea with biscuits when the social worker arrived. Fred smiled a lot. Heather said very little. After that, Fred and Rose grew more cautious, but also more threatening. They started using a phrase around the house whenever someone misbehaved. "You'll end up under the patio like Heather." For a long time, the other kids thought it was just a twisted joke. Heather had disappeared in 1987. Fred and Rose told neighbors she'd gone off to work at a holiday camp. When relatives asked why she hadn't called, Rose shrugged and said Heather was a moody little cow who didn't want contact. It was all said so casually that people believed it. But here's the strange fact. Fred couldn't stop referencing her. Even years later, he'd slip Heather into conversation. One time, he told a lodger that he knew a girl who liked being tied up. He paused, then added, "Not anymore, though. She's quiet now." No one asked what he meant. In 1994, during a police interview, one officer leaned in and whispered, "Fred, we need to talk about Heather." Fred blinked, then nodded. 3 hours later, he led them into the house, down the hall, and pointed to the floor by the staircase. "She's there," he said. "I'll help you dig." And he did. He helped them dig up his daughter. Heather's bones were curled up in a fetal position. Her wrists had been bound with electrical cable. A narrow piece of fabric, possibly from a pillowcase, was found in her mouth, wedged between her molars. Some bones were missing, later recovered in fragments. A few were never found. The forensic team noted something unusual. The floor had been carefully relaid over her grave. Concrete poured, smoothed, sanded, the kind of attention to detail Fred rarely showed elsewhere. One officer said it looked like a monument. And now, here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Criminologists argue over why Fred and Rose killed Heather. Was it because she knew too much? Because she threatened to go to the police? Or, perhaps most chillingly, was she just another victim to them? A few scholars point out that Heather wasn't the first child abused in the West household, but she may have been the first to resist, to draw boundaries. Others argue it wasn't about resistance at all. It was about power, about control, about erasing someone who reminded them of their own vulnerability. But another theory goes even deeper, that Heather represented the last part of Fred and Rose's lives that still felt human. She was their daughter, their flesh and blood. And destroying her was a kind of final test, proof that nothing was sacred anymore, that even family was subject to their will. After Heather's body was discovered, the rest of the West children began to speak, and what they described was a home built on fear. Fred installed peepholes in the doors. He watched the girls as they changed. He made them undress in front of him for inspections. Rose beat them for imagined sins. Sometimes Fred joined in. Other times, he just watched. And above all, there was the silence. The kind of silence that seeps into your bones, that teaches you not to cry, not to ask questions, not to open the wrong door. Because opening the wrong door meant you'd end up like Heather. The rest of the children were taken into protective custody in 1993. It was too late for Heather. Too late for the others buried in the garden, in the cellar, under the bathroom floor. But somehow, it was Heather's name, the one whispered for years, that finally cracked the case open. A girl who had no voice in life became the loudest cry for justice after death. They say the police turned off all the lights when they left Cromwell Street for the last time, that they stood on the pavement and stared at the house in silence, and that one officer muttered, "It's not a house, it's a graveyard with wallpaper." By the time we reached the garden, the press had swarmed 25 Cromwell Street. Journalists leaned over fences with microphones, photographers camped outside the police cordon, and neighbors stood in robes, stunned, watching the excavation unfold like a horror film. Every inch of soil in the back garden was now sacred ground, or evidence. Fred had given the police just enough to start digging. He pointed to a rose bush and said, "Try there first." And beneath that bush, they found the remains of Shirley Robinson, one of the few victims Fred ever admitted to killing. She was 18, a lodger, heavily pregnant. Fred told police the baby was his. Let that sink in. Fred buried his unborn child beside its mother and laid a rose bush on top of them like a headstone. The garden at Cromwell Street was small, maybe 15 feet long, but it was packed with secrets. By the end of the first week, police had uncovered 3 full skeletons, each with their wrists bound, knees drawn to the chest. Their skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma. Gags and restraints had decayed into scraps, but they were there. Always there. One officer called it a backyard of bondage and murder. Fred's method was systematic. He'd dismember bodies with surgical precision, remove fingers, toes, kneecaps, bury them in fetal positions, often with sexual paraphernalia. Sometimes, he'd even return to the burial site, digging them up, moving bones around, then reburying them, almost like he couldn't let go. The forensic team was meticulous. They sifted every layer of dirt, cataloged each bone, mapped the burial positions. The garden became a site of ritual investigation. Not just of crime, but of psychology. Here's the strange fact from this part of the case. Fred once joked about the garden being full of girls. Neighbors thought he was just a dirty old man with a sick sense of humor, but he'd literally been telling the truth for years. One former lodger recalled Fred saying, "Careful where you step, love. You'll wake the girls." No one laughed. They just assumed it was one of his weird, offhand remarks. As the bones came up, one by one, questions grew. Why so many? How did no one notice? And most unsettling of all, how many more were there? Here's where the academic debate intensifies. Criminologists have long argued over Rose's role in these particular murders. Some believe Fred acted alone in the garden killings, that he'd lure women, kill them, and quietly dispose of them while Rose stayed upstairs with the kids. But others, including the forensic psychologists who interviewed her, don't buy that. They point to the bindings, the sexual torture, the precise mutilation that matched descriptions from multiple survivors of Rose's abuse. They argue that Rose wasn't just aware, she was present, perhaps even the instigator. One survivor, Caroline Roberts, who escaped, claimed that Rose was more violent than Fred, that she took pleasure in hurting other women, and that she seemed jealous whenever Fred focused too much attention on someone else. It wasn't just about sex. It was about domination, about complete erasure. Fred and Rose didn't just murder these women. They tried to erase them from existence. No headstones, no funerals, just dirt, bricks, and silence. The garden gave up more names. Lucy Partington, a 21-year-old university student who vanished on Christmas Eve, 1973. She'd been waiting at a bus stop when Fred picked her up. Her body was found with a knife embedded in her pelvis. Therese Siegenthaler, a 21-year-old Swiss student hitchhiking to Ireland. She disappeared in 1974 and was buried under a makeshift barbecue pit. Her parents had searched for decades. Juanita Mott, 18. She'd lived with the Wests for a while before vanishing in 1975. Her skeleton bore signs of long-term abuse before death. There was a horrifying pattern. Fred and Rose would offer young women a place to stay. Then they'd isolate them, torture them, kill them, and bury them in a space meant for children to play. Some scholars argue the garden was Fred's version of control, that burying the bodies gave him a sense of permanence, that he was building his own private cemetery, a place where only he knew the names of the dead. Others see it differently. They suggest the garden was Rose's punishment ground, that she buried rivals there, that she stood at the window while Fred dug, arms crossed, ensuring he did it properly. Still, no one can say for sure. Fred, even in confession, loved to lie. Sometimes he exaggerated. Other times, he minimized. He once said, "I put them in the garden so they could be close to home." Another time, he said, they didn't scream much after the first hour. But perhaps the most chilling moment came when one detective asked, "How many more are out there, Fred?" Fred leaned back, scratched his chin, and said, open quote, "I can't remember all their names, but you'll know them when you find them. They're the ones that never screamed." Close quote. They stopped digging in the garden after uncovering 9 sets of remains. Fred claimed there were more, much more, but never gave exact locations. Some believe the fields outside Much Marcle, where Fred grew up, hold additional bodies. Others suspect Gloucester's canals. A few even believe the concrete floor of the nearby cafe the Wests once owned hides another grave. The full truth may never be known, but the garden at Cromwell Street became a symbol, not just of evil, but of ignored warning signs, of missed chances, of women who vanished because they were poor or young or transient, and of a society that didn't believe them until it was far too late. After the garden, investigators turned their attention inside 20 Cromwell Street. They had already begun pulling up floorboards, stripping plaster, and scanning walls with ground-penetrating radar. But what they found next chilled even the most seasoned officers. Under the basement concrete, laid in thick, uneven slabs by Fred himself, were more bodies. The first was Shirley Hubbard, just 15 years old. Her skull was found wrapped in tape, entirely covering her face, with only a plastic tube inserted into her nose so she could breathe. Investigators believe Fred and Rose kept her alive like that, blind and suffocating, before finally killing her. It wasn't just murder. It was ritualized sadism. Each girl was found in a similar state. Limbs bound, bodies contorted, signs of prolonged torture. Fred had poured concrete out over them like it was a home improvement project. No ceremony, just cold, wet cement over flesh. The next was Allison Chambers, 17, reported missing in 1979. She had been estranged from her family, living rough. Fred told one cellmate she asked too many questions. Then came Heather West, their daughter. She had been the whispered secret in the West household. The name no one mentioned, the one Fred joked about being under the patio. A line he'd repeated so many times, even his younger children thought it was just dark humor. It wasn't. Heather had confided in a school friend about the abuse, said her father did things to her at night, that her mother knew, that sometimes they both took part. The friend didn't believe her. Then Heather vanished. Rose told neighbors she'd run off to get a job. Fred told his kids that she was working at a holiday camp. But no postcards ever came, no phone calls, just silence. Her body was found beneath the bathroom floor. Naked, dismembered, jaw broken, signs of strangulation. Fred later confessed to murdering her in a moment of anger after she threatened to tell the police, but the injuries said otherwise. The forensics team found that Heather had been tortured over several hours. One officer described it as the moment the case shifted from serial murder to something darker, filicide committed for pleasure. It was a line few had crossed in British criminal history. Here's the strange fact. Fred buried Heather just a few feet from the kitchen, the most domestic space of the house. Then he poured a concrete floor over her, installed a washing machine, and used it daily. Each time the spin cycle kicked in, the vibrations passed through her bones. Fred once told a psychologist that Heather's death was necessary because she talked too much. But that he missed her smile. When asked what he meant by that, he reportedly said, open quote, "Well, she looked like me," close quote. Heather's murder shattered what remained of the West's fragile illusion of family. Social services, who had long ignored signs of abuse, were now under intense scrutiny. Multiple reports had been filed over the years about bruises on the West's children, strange comments about games their parents made them play. A teacher once filed a formal concern after Anne-Marie, another daughter, arrived to class limping, covered in marks. But each time, the reports were lost in bureaucracy or dismissed as parenting differences. The debate that emerged from this is still ongoing. Many scholars argue that the British child welfare system failed catastrophically in the case of the West children, that a combination of institutional bias, overworked staff, and assumptions about poverty led authorities to ignore decades of red flags. Others point to something deeper, a cultural reluctance to believe that a mother, particularly one like Rose, who presented herself as passive, quiet, even matronly, could be capable of active participation in sexual sadism and murder. Rose had weaponized those expectations. She would smile at social workers, serve tea, pretend to be overwhelmed by the chaos of the house. They called her a rough but well-meaning mom. But Rose wasn't overwhelmed. She was orchestrating. When police finally brought her in for questioning about Heather, she didn't cry, didn't ask for a lawyer. She just said, open quote, "I've done nothing wrong. It was all Fred," close quote. Fred, however, had begun to break. In custody, he kept trying to protect Rose. She knew nothing, he'd say. "I did it all." But then in one interview, he slipped. He said, "Rose had her fun, same as me." And just like that, the mask cracked. When police confronted her with Fred's confession, Rose snapped, threw a chair, screamed, "He's a liar. He's trying to ruin me." But the evidence was mounting. Fast. A former nanny came forward and said she'd once seen Rose beat a toddler unconscious. A former lodger claimed he'd walked in on Rose strangling a girl in the basement. And Fred watching, laughing. And then there were the tapes. Fred had filmed some of the torture sessions. The tapes had vanished, probably destroyed, but descriptions of them, provided by witnesses who had seen them, were horrifying. Rose was in them, leading, mocking, commanding. It wasn't just Fred's house of horrors, it was theirs. 25 Cromwell Street was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, a crypt, a museum of the macabre. The pathologist assigned to the case said something that still haunts me. Open quote, "The walls remember. The pipes remember. Even the silence in the hallways remembers." Close quote. When Fred was finally charged with 12 counts of murder, he didn't flinch. He asked one thing. Open quote, "Will Rose be all right?" But she wouldn't be, because the real trial was coming, and it would expose everything. By the time the dust settled around 25 Cromwell Street, 12 murder charges had been filed against Fred West. He would never stand trial. On New Year's Day 1995, Fred was found hanged in his prison cell at HM Prison, Birmingham. He'd used a bedsheet tied to a window grate. He left no suicide note, only a Bible, a photo of Rose, and a crude drawing of a gravestone. On it he'd written, open quote, "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West, rest in peace where no shadow falls," close quote. A final fantasy of death as a love story. But for Rosemary, the real reckoning was only just beginning. Unlike Fred, she maintained her innocence, claimed she'd had no knowledge of the murders, no part in the torture, and no idea bodies were buried under her floor. The Crown wasn't buying it. In 1995, Rose West was charged with 10 counts of murder. Fred's death left a gaping hole in the prosecution's case. He had been both a defendant and a key witness. Without him, proving Rose's active involvement became harder. But the prosecution leaned on two things: survivor testimony and patterns of behavior. First was Anne-Marie West, Rose's own stepdaughter. In court, Anne-Marie recounted years of sexual abuse by Fred and Rose. She described being forced to watch pornography, being tied up, gagged, and assaulted, often by both parents. She said Rose was never passive. In fact, she was often the one who started things. Anne-Marie's voice cracked when she spoke of Charmaine, her half-sister. Charmaine had been 8 years old when she vanished. Fred later confessed that Rose killed her during one of his stints in prison. She couldn't stand the girl's backtalk. Police had found Charmaine's remains buried under the kitchen at 25 Midland Road, the West's previous address. Her bones showed signs of post-mortem dismemberment and pre-death injury. Then came testimony from Caroline Owens, the teenage nanny Fred and Rose had abducted and assaulted in 1972. She described being lured into the car, knocked out, and waking up naked, tied to a bed with both Fred and Rose watching. She survived, barely, and had testified once before in the 70s. But the original court had let Fred off with a fine and dropped charges against Rose. Now Caroline faced Rose again, older, stronger. She looked directly at her and said, open quote, "You were there. You helped. You enjoyed it." Close quote. Other witnesses included former lodgers, clients from Rose's sex work, even her own children. All painted a picture of a woman not coerced but complicit. Enthusiastic, even. The prosecution presented a pattern. Most of the girls were abducted from bus stops or taken in as lodgers. They were sexually assaulted, bound, mutilated, and then murdered. Their remains were buried in or around the home. And here's the strange fact. Rose continued her sex work after some of the murders. In fact, police discovered she had entertained clients in the very room where bodies were buried beneath the floor. It wasn't just depravity, it was daily life. Clients would describe her as cold, sometimes violent, sometimes maternal. She kept a notebook of names, fantasies, and session ideas. Police found one entry titled, open quote, "Silence game, gag plus mirror." Close quote, that mirror again, always reflecting. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Rose sat stone-faced throughout, never cried, never shouted, just stared ahead, almost serene. Her defense argued that Fred had manipulated her, that she was a battered wife living in fear, that he had acted alone. But the jury didn't believe it. On November 22, 1995, Rosemary West was found guilty on all 10 counts of murder. She became only the second woman in modern British history to receive a whole life tariff, meaning she would die in prison with no possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, she blinked. Once. Then turned to the gallery, looking for someone, maybe one of her children. No one met her gaze. The academic debate that emerged afterward split down uncomfortable lines. Some scholars asked, was Rose a victim of coercive control? Could she have been groomed by Fred? Traumatized into compliance? After all, she met Fred when she was just 15. He was twice her age, already experienced in violence. But others pushed back. They pointed to the independent killings, like Charmaine's murder, which occurred while Fred was in jail. They highlighted her leadership in certain crimes, her sexual aggression, her refusal to confess or show remorse. Psychiatrist Dr. Richard Badcock, who reviewed the case, concluded, open quote, "Rosemary West exhibits traits of psychopathy, specifically sadistic tendencies and emotional detachment. Her crimes were not those of a victim, but of a predator." Close quote. Rose never admitted guilt, not once. To this day, she claims she was framed by the system and betrayed by Fred. Her remaining children are split. Some visit her in prison, others never speak her name. And what of 25 Cromwell Street? After the investigation ended, the local council voted to demolish the entire building. On October 7, 1996, the house was razed to the ground. The land was turned into a pathway, no plaque, no sign, no memorial, just empty space. It's said that grass refuses to grow there, as if the earth itself remembers what happened, or maybe chooses not to. Next time, we'll explore the final chapter, what Fred and Rose West left behind, not just in physical bodies, but in the systems, institutions, and psyches they exploited. The trial of Rosemary West left a permanent scar on British society. It wasn't just about the murders. It was about the systemic failures, the blind eyes, the missed warnings, the neighbors who kept quiet, and the institutions that lost track of children. After the verdict, the public and press turned inward, asking hard questions. One of the most uncomfortable was this, open quote, "How did Fred and Rose West get away with murder for over 2 decades, right under everyone's noses?" Close quote. The answer wasn't just one thing. It was many. Let's start with the children. The Wests had at least 8 children together, and several more from Fred's previous relationships. Many of them lived inside 25 Cromwell Street throughout the killings. Some of those children were subjected to physical abuse. Others were sexually assaulted. Several later told police they had heard screaming coming from the cellar or seen blood in the bathroom. And yet, no one stepped in. There had been warnings. In fact, social services had visited the home multiple times. In the 1970s, one teacher even wrote to the authorities, expressing concern about Anne-Marie's injuries and behavior. But nothing happened. Back then, child welfare protocols were loose. And Fred and Rose had mastered the art of charming or intimidating visitors. The house was usually tidy when officials arrived. The children were coached on what to say. It worked. Another system that failed, law enforcement. Fred West had a criminal record going back to the 1960s. He'd been jailed for theft, violence, and even sexual assault. In one case, a teenage girl accused both Fred and Rose of kidnapping and rape. She testified in court, but the judge dismissed Rose's involvement, calling her a devoted wife and mother. Fred got a fine. Rose walked away. That girl was Caroline Owens. She would later return to testify in the murder trial. Then there were the missing persons reports. Several of Fred and Rose's victims had been reported missing by family members or schools. But police at the time classified them as runaways, young girls drifting off to London or Bristol. Cases were closed with a shrug. One of the saddest examples was Shirley Robinson, one of Fred's lodgers and alleged lovers. She was 18 and pregnant when she disappeared. Her family filed a report. Police dismissed it. Years later, her remains were found buried in the garden of Cromwell Street, her unborn child still inside her. Which brings us to the strange fact in this chapter. Fred West applied to be a school lollipop man in the early 1990s, a crossing guard for children. And he almost got the job. His criminal background check came back clean due to clerical errors and outdated records. It was only public outcry that stopped the appointment. He had been walking the streets, eyeing children, wearing the uniform. Unbelievable, but true. This failure of institutions prompted a series of nationwide reforms. In the years following the West trial, the UK government overhauled its child protection system. Background checks were tightened. Interagency communication between schools, social workers, and law enforcement was improved. In 2002, the Every Child Matters framework was introduced, a sweeping reform that emphasized early intervention and accountability. But even so, critics say the damage was already done. There's also the psychological toll to consider. Several of the West children later struggled with depression, PTSD, and addiction. A few changed their names and went into hiding. In rare interviews, they speak of nightmares, dissociation, and guilt, survivor's guilt. Some remember the sound of digging at night. Others recall being told not to go in the basement. They were kids. They couldn't understand what they were living through. And once the truth came out, they couldn't understand how no one stopped it. Scholars still debate the institutional breakdowns. Was it incompetence, underfunding, cultural blind spots about domestic abuse and sexual violence? Or perhaps something even darker, a collective denial, a refusal to believe that a family could be so evil, so grotesquely abusive, behind a garden fence. Dr. Sarah Jones, a criminologist at Oxford, described it this way, open quote, "Fred and Rose West did not operate in a vacuum. They thrived in the cracks of a broken system, one that didn't believe children, didn't connect dots, and didn't want to imagine that horror could live in plain sight." Close quote. One of the more controversial ideas came from sociologist Peter Vronsky, who suggested the Wests were the product of generational deviance. That Fred's early abuse, combined with cultural repression and misogyny, created a perfect storm of psychopathy. But even he admitted, none of it excuses what they did. It only explains the silence that surrounded them. Today, the site of 25 Cromwell Street remains empty. No homes, no shops, just a concrete walkway and a silence that feels too loud. Locals cross the street when passing it. Tourists sometimes stop, take a photo, and move on. But no one lingers. Even time seems unwilling to stay too long. And yet, there are echoes. Some of Fred and Rose's old photos still float around the internet, smiling at birthday parties, sunbathing in the yard, holding babies. To the casual viewer, they look ordinary, even wholesome. That's the danger, isn't it? Monsters don't always look like monsters. They smile, they wave, they build homes with locked doors and hidden rooms. And in that space between what we see and what we fear, the unimaginable becomes real. Next time, we'll enter the penultimate chapter, the psychological profiles of Fred and Rose, how two very different minds became entangled in shared darkness. Fred West was already damaged long before he met Rose. Born in 1941 in rural Herefordshire, Fred grew up in a chaotic and allegedly abusive household. His father was strict and violent. His mother, by some accounts, was overbearing, and perhaps worse. Fred would later claim that his father encouraged incest and that sexual abuse was normalized in the family. Some of this may have been exaggeration, but whatever the truth, Fred left school barely literate and already deeply disturbed. By his late teens, he'd suffered 2 major head injuries, one from a motorcycle crash, another from falling off a fire escape. Doctors noted long-term damage. He began showing signs of disinhibition, a loss of impulse control, particularly around sex and violence. There's a well-known link in criminal psychology called the McDonald Triad, a theory that early signs of future violent behavior include cruelty to animals, setting fires, and bedwetting. Fred didn't fit all 3, but he tortured animals, had obsessive sexual fantasies, and became increasingly fascinated by control. He married his first wife, Rena Costello, in the 1960s, but even then, his behavior was troubling. He beat her, cheated on her. And when she left, he kidnapped her daughter from a previous relationship and claimed her as his own. That little girl's name was Charmaine. She would later become one of the West's first known victims, killed and buried under the kitchen floor. Then came Rosemary Letts. She met Fred when she was just 15. He was 27. She worked at a bakery counter. He came in often. They began an affair. Rose's background wasn't much better. Her father, Bill Letts, was a paranoid schizophrenic and allegedly sexually abusive. Her mother, Daisy, underwent electroconvulsive therapy during pregnancy, something researchers have long debated in terms of prenatal effects. By all accounts, Rose was violent, impulsive, and prone to mood swings even before meeting Fred. But something clicked between them. Fred saw in Rose a partner who wasn't afraid of taboo. Rose saw in Fred someone who normalized the darkest urges she'd been taught to hide. Together, they didn't just commit murder. They built a system around it. Fred was the manipulator, the one who lured young women, spun lies, promised jobs or safety. Rose was the enforcer. Once they entered the house, she controlled the violence. She often initiated the abuse, and they filmed everything. Home videos were discovered later, but many were destroyed before police could recover them. Investigators described what remained as depraved beyond comprehension. One forensic psychologist, Dr. Richard Whittington Egan, described them as co-sadists, a rare partnership where both individuals not only tolerate extreme cruelty, but feed off each other's escalating brutality. This brings us to today's strange fact. Open quote, Rose West was a popular pen pal in prison. After her conviction, she received hundreds of letters, many from men who described her as misunderstood or wrongly accused. Some even proposed marriage. In this centered, close quote, this isn't uncommon. In fact, it's a phenomenon with a name, hybristophilia, a psychological condition in which individuals are sexually aroused by partners who commit violent crimes. Why do some people fall in love with serial killers? Scholars argue it's a mix of fascination with power, a desire to fix or rescue the criminal, or the belief that they're seeing a side no one else can. In Rose's case, it also raised questions about female serial killers, how society treats them differently. Many people assume women are less likely to commit sexual or sadistic murders. Statistically, that's true, but Rose broke the mold. She wasn't an accessory. She wasn't passive. She was often the instigator. Psychologist Elizabeth Yardley, who studied the Wests extensively, said, open quote, people want to believe Rose was brainwashed, that Fred made her do it. But that strips her of agency. The truth is more disturbing. She chose this path, close quote. And then there's the scholarly debate. Can Fred and Rose be classified as folie à deux, a psychiatric term for shared psychosis? This rare condition occurs when two people, often in close isolation, begin to share a delusional belief system. It's been used to explain pairs like the Parker-Hulme case in New Zealand or the Erickson twins in the UK. In the Wests' case, some scholars argue they created a self-contained world of moral collapse, a belief that what they were doing was justified, even necessary. Others disagree. They point out that both Fred and Rose behaved rationally in public. They covered their tracks, made strategic decisions, and manipulated people to protect themselves. This isn't delusion, it's calculation. And while Fred confessed to many murders, he minimized Rose's role. Whether out of love or control is still debated. Rose, to this day, maintains her innocence. She has never admitted to a single murder. She's currently held at Newhall Prison under a life sentence. She rarely speaks. Her children refuse to visit. Most of the British public would prefer she never be heard from again. And yet, her legacy lingers. Because unlike Fred, who died by suicide before trial, Rose never gave the victims' families closure. She never said, "I'm sorry. This is what happened. Here's where the bodies are." She took the truth with her. And perhaps that's the cruelest act of all. In our next chapter, we'll look at the public aftermath, the media storm, the destruction of Cromwell Street, and how the community of Gloucester tried to bury not just the bones, but the memory. After Fred West's suicide in prison in January 1995, everything changed. There would be no trial, no cross-examinations, no final answers from the man who'd been at the center of it all. And so attention shifted fully to Rosemary West, who still refused to speak. But even more than that, it shifted to the house. 25 Cromwell Street, a modest 3-story terraced home in the heart of Gloucester. To anyone walking by, it looked unremarkable. A pale pink exterior, a small front garden, curtains drawn tight. But what lay inside had shocked even the most seasoned detectives. When police began excavating in early 1994, they expected to find 1 or 2 bodies. They found 10, all dismembered, most with signs of sexual torture, and all hidden within the walls, floor, and backyard of the home. Each discovery was like peeling back another layer of rot. In the cellar, they found makeshift restraints bolted to wooden beams. In the bathroom, they found clumps of human hair clogging old plumbing. Even the children's playroom had dark stains that couldn't be explained away. The media descended instantly. TV crews set up outside. Reporters from all over the world huddled in the rain. Locals started calling it the House of Horrors. People came just to take pictures of the front door. Some brought souvenirs, stones, bricks, even grass from the lawn. The situation spiraled. Children had nightmares. Nearby homes plummeted in value. Tourists took selfies next to crime scene tape. It was grotesque. It was grief turned into spectacle. Gloucester city officials quickly realized something had to be done. They debated options. Should it become a museum, like some Holocaust or war memorials? Should it be sealed and left empty? Eventually, they made a radical choice. Open quote, the house would be completely destroyed. Close quote. In October 1996, work crews arrived early in the morning. They began dismantling the structure brick by brick under police guard. All debris was incinerated off-site. Even the foundation was dug out and replaced with fresh soil. By the end, nothing was left but an empty lot. A small footpath was laid down where the house once stood. No memorial, no plaque, no sign that anything had ever been there. It was as if the city tried to erase the memory through absence. But memory doesn't work that way. Here's your strange fact for this chapter. Open quote, Cromwell Street still receives fan mail. Even though the house is gone, people send letters, flowers, and drawings to the old address, some addressed to Fred and Rose West. Close quote, many of these are intercepted and destroyed. Some are from those fascinated by serial killers. Others are simply curious. Some even call it a pilgrimage site, despite there being nothing left to see. It raises an uncomfortable question. Why are we so drawn to places of horror? Academics call it dark tourism. From Auschwitz to the site of the Jonestown Massacre, people have long visited the locations of tragedy. Some come to mourn. Others come to understand. Some, disturbingly, come for entertainment. Professor Philip Stone, who studies this phenomenon, argues, open quote, these sites force us to confront mortality, morality, and our shared human capacity for evil. But without context, they risk becoming voyeuristic. Close quote. That's why Gloucester acted swiftly. They feared that 25 Cromwell Street would become an attraction, like the Manson house or Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. They didn't want their city defined by murder. But as one local shop owner put it, open quote, you can tear down a house, but you can't tear down history. Close quote. And then there's the community. People who lived on the same street. Children who had played in the garden next door. Teachers who had taught the West children, never realizing what those kids went home to. After the trial, a counseling center was opened specifically for people affected by the case. It wasn't just for victims' families. It was for neighbors, friends, old schoolmates, even police. Because the trauma was collective. Everyone had to carry a piece of it. And yet, even as the dust settled and the lot remained empty, the names of the victims remained incomplete. Fred hinted at more graves. Rose never confirmed anything. Some believe the Wests killed as many as 30 women. We only know about 12 confirmed deaths. Which leads to this final debate. Should the site have been preserved for forensic science? Some criminologists argue that future technology, like advanced DNA sequencing or ground-penetrating radar, could have revealed new victims or evidence. Others counter that the damage to the community was too great, that the house had become a symbol of evil that needed to be destroyed. This clash between memory and mercy, history and healing, has never been fully resolved. And now, 25 Cromwell Street exists only in photos, books, and nightmares. But in part 14, we turn away from the house and toward those who lived through it. The surviving West children, the ones who escaped, and what they remember. The ones who got out in the media, the story of Fred and Rose West was dominated by the horror, the cellar, the bones, the betrayals, the lies. But lost in all of it, nearly forgotten, were the children. Because while the Wests were burying bodies beneath their home, they were also raising a family in it. At least 8 children lived at 25 Cromwell Street at various points. Some were their biological kids. Some were children from previous relationships. Some were simply taken in or born to women who later disappeared. And most of them were abused in ways that are difficult to put into words. But we need to try, because understanding what they endured is key to understanding how evil hides in plain sight. The West children lived with a terrifying contradiction. By day, their home looked ordinary. They went to school, watched cartoons, ate fish fingers. But at night, the house came alive. Fred would roam the hallways, sometimes drunk, sometimes silent. Rose's mood could change in an instant, from maternal to monstrous. The children heard noises in the cellar, sometimes screams, other times pleading. Fred told them never to go down there. He said it was where the bad girls go, that if they misbehaved, they'd end up there too. They were beaten, some were raped, some were forced to watch as others were abused. It's uncomfortable to imagine, but imagine it we must. Because this is not just the story of killers, it's the story of those who survived them. Perhaps the most vocal of the West children is Mae West, Fred and Rose's biological daughter. Born in 1972, she lived at Cromwell Street through its darkest years. She has since written a memoir, appeared in documentaries, and spoken candidly about her past. Open quote, "It wasn't until I was about 10, she said, that I realized what happened in our house wasn't normal." Close quote. Mae remembers birthdays where the cake was homemade while a dead body decomposed in the garden. She remembers being pulled from school unexpectedly. She remembers neighbors whispering, but no one helped. And Mae says that's the real tragedy. So many adults had suspicions. Teachers, social workers, even the police. But nothing was done. That's not entirely true. Social services did visit the house multiple times, but Fred and Rose were skilled manipulators. They knew how to play the system. Fred dressed in his best sweater. Rose put out a plate of biscuits. The children were told to smile, or else. So inspectors walked in, saw what looked like a cramped but tidy home, and walked out again. Time after time. One of the most disturbing facts is this. Open quote, at least 2 of the victims buried at Cromwell Street were nannies hired to look after the children. Close quote, women who responded to ads, who moved in, who were never seen again. And the kids noticed. They'd wake up one morning and be told, open quote, "Shirley's gone. She ran away." Close quote. And then a new woman would appear a few weeks later. Fred and Rose had a rotating cast of victims, hidden in plain sight, disguised as caretakers. It was a system of abuse, perfected over years, and yet somehow some children escaped. In 1992, it was one brave teenage daughter, known in court documents as Lucy, who finally broke the silence. She went to police. She told them what Fred had done, what Rose had done, what was in the cellar. Her testimony, just one voice, set off the entire investigation that followed. Without her, it's likely the Wests would never have been caught. Here's your strange fact for this chapter. Open quote, Fred West built secret rooms in multiple homes, not just Cromwell Street. In one previous house in Gloucester, neighbors recalled him digging a trench beneath the floorboards to improve plumbing. Years later, nothing was ever found. But police still suspect other victims may be buried there. Close quote. It leads to a chilling possibility that even now, bodies may be hidden in places Fred once lived, and no one has found them yet. There's an ongoing debate among psychologists. Can children of serial killers ever truly heal? Some believe they can, through therapy, love, and distance from their past. Others argue that the trauma runs too deep, especially when the abuse was personal. Mae West once said, open quote, "People want me to be either completely broken or completely fine. I'm neither. I'm surviving." Close quote. She and several of her siblings have changed their names, moved abroad, and tried to rebuild their lives. But nightmares remain. One sibling took their own life. Another remains estranged. Some refuse to speak about the past at all. Because the truth is, survival is not the end of the story. For many, it's just the beginning of a different kind of suffering. And in part 15, the final chapter, will bring this case to its close. Not with a clean conclusion, but with the messy, uncomfortable truth about how a case like this can happen at all. And whether it could happen again. I'll never forget the moment I saw it, a photograph in the Gloucester Courthouse archive. A simple black and white picture of 25 Cromwell Street, taken the day the house was torn down. The lot was empty, just gravel and dirt where a home had stood for decades. But in the corner of the frame, someone had written in faded pen, open quote, "Let no house like this stand again," close quote. It stuck with me. Because tearing down a house doesn't erase what happened inside it. It just covers it with silence. Fred West died in his prison cell on January 1st, 1995. He had confessed to 12 murders but likely committed more. The truth died with him, by his own hand. He hanged himself with bed sheets in HM Prison, Birmingham. Rose West, however, stood trial. In November of that same year, she was convicted of 10 murders, including her own daughter. She received a whole life tariff, meaning she will never be released. To this day, she maintains her innocence, even as her children testify against her, even as the evidence is overwhelming. She lives in a prison in West Yorkshire. Reports say she rarely speaks, no visitors, no interviews, just silence. When the trials ended, the city of Gloucester faced a dilemma. What to do with 25 Cromwell Street? The answer came quickly. Demolish it. On October 7, 1996, the house was razed to the ground. Bulldozers came in. Concrete was poured over the foundation, and the address was removed from official maps. It no longer exists, not even as a parking lot, just a blank space. But for many, that only raised more questions. What about the other victims Fred hinted at? What about the bones found in nearby fields, never identified? What about the missing girls from the 1970s who were never connected but fit the profile? The investigation was officially closed in 1997, but closure remains elusive. Even now, retired detectives admit, open quote, "We don't know the full extent of what they did," close quote. Here's your final strange fact. Open quote, in 2021, police returned to a cafe in Gloucester, once run by Fred West in the 1960s. They believed the body of Mary Bastholm, a 15-year-old girl who vanished in 1968, might be buried in the basement. Cadaver dogs and radar were brought in. Excavations were done, but nothing was found. Close quote. Still, locals are convinced Fred had something to do with her disappearance. And maybe he did, but we may never know. So what are we left with? A case that feels too monstrous to believe, and yet it happened. Fred and Rose West were not evil in the abstract. They were real people, with jobs, with neighbors, with children. They existed in plain sight for over 20 years, and no one stopped them. The question isn't just how they got away with it, it's why we let them, because it wasn't just missed opportunities. It was denial, a collective unwillingness to see what was right in front of us. A girl showed up with bruises. She was clumsy. A tenant disappeared. She probably moved. A child said something strange. Kids have wild imaginations, and so we explained it away, again and again, until it was too late. There's one last academic debate I want to leave you with. It's about memory. Scholars have argued that crimes like these aren't just traumatic, they're incomprehensible, that the human mind literally cannot contain them. And so we push them to the edges of our culture. We forget, we sanitize, we move on. But forgetting is dangerous, because monsters don't live in basements. They live in ordinary homes, on quiet streets, behind closed doors. Fred and Rose West are gone. But the conditions that allowed them to thrive, they still exist. And that's why we tell these stories. Not to scare you, not to sensationalize, but because remembrance is prevention. The minute we stop remembering what happened in that house, we risk letting it happen again. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let your last thought be this: there is no such thing as an evil house, only evil that hides within the walls. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing of all is how normal it all looked from the outside.